An excerpt from Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, Untold History's Wild Possibilities. This is from Chapter 1, Looking into Darkness. On January 18th, 1915, 6 months into the First World War, as all Europe was convulsed by killing and dying, Virginia Woolf wrote in her journal, "The future is dark, which is on the whole the best thing the future can be, I think." Dark, she seems to be saying, as in inscrutable, not as in terrible. We often mistake the one for the other, or we transform the future's unknowability into something certain, the fulfillment of all our dread, the place beyond which there is no way forward. But again and again, far stranger things happen than the end of the world. Who, 2 decades ago, could have imagined a world in which the Soviet Union had vanished and the Internet had arrived? Who then dreamed that the political prisoner Nelson Mandela would become president of a transformed South Africa? Who foresaw the resurgence of the indigenous world of which the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico is only the most visible face? Who, 4 decades ago, could have conceived of the changed status of all who are non-white, non-male, or non-straight, the wide-open conversations about power, nature, economies, and ecologies? There are times when it seems as though not only the future but the present is dark. Few recognize what a radically transformed world we live in, one that has been transformed not only by such nightmares as global warming and global capital, but by dreams of freedom and of justice, and transformed by things we could not have dreamed of. We adjust to changes without measuring them. We forget how much the culture has changed. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay rights on a grand scale last summer, a ruling inconceivable a few decades ago. What accretion of incremental, imperceptible changes made that possible, and how did they come about? And so we need to hope for the realization of our own dreams, but also to recognize a world that will remain wilder than our imaginations. 21 years ago this June, 1 million people gathered in New York City's Central Park to demand a nuclear freeze. They didn't get it. The freeze movement was full of people who believed they'd realize their goal in a few years and then go home. They were motivated by a storyline in which the world would be made safe for, among other things, going home from activism. Many went home disappointed or burned out, though some are still doing great work. But in less than a decade, major nuclear arms reductions were negotiated, helped along by European anti-nuclear movements and the impetus they gave the Soviet Union's last Prime Minister, Mikhail Gorbachev. Since then, the issue has fallen off the map, and we've lost much of what was gained. The United States never ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which could have put an end to nuclear weapons development and proliferation. Instead, the arms race continues as new nations go nuclear, and the current Bush administration is planning to resume the full-fledged nuclear testing halted in 1991 to resume development of a new generation of nuclear weapons, to expand the arsenal, and perhaps even to use it in once proscribed ways. The activism of the freeze era cut itself short, with a fixed vision and an unrealistic timeline, not anticipating that the Cold War would come to an end at the close of the decade. They didn't push hard enough or stay long enough to collect the famous peace dividend, and so there was none. It's always too soon to go home. And it's always too soon to calculate effect. I once read an anecdote by someone involved in Women's Strike for Peace, WSP, the first great anti-nuclear movement in the United States, the one that did contribute to a major victory. The end in 1963 of above ground of nuclear testing, and so of the radioactive fallout that was showing up in mother's milk and baby teeth, and to the fall of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Homeland Security Department of its day, positioning themselves as housewives and using humor as their weapon. They made HUAC's anti-communist interrogations look ridiculous. The woman from WSP told of how foolish and futile she had felt standing in the rain one morning, protesting at the Kennedy White House. Years later, she heard Dr. Benjamin Spook, who had become one of the most high-profile activists on the issue, say that the turning point for him was spotting a small group of women standing in the rain protesting at the White House. If they were so passionately committed, he thought, he should give the issue more consideration himself. Causes and effects assume history marches forward, but history is not an army. It's a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or her words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world. Sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and change comes upon us like a change of weather. All that these transformations have in common is that they begin in the imagination, in hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear. For to live is to risk. I say this to you because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say this because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door. Because it will take everything you have to steal the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible. Not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. At the beginning of his massive 1930s treatise on hope, the German philosopher Ernst Bloch wrote, "The work of this emotion requires people who throw themselves actively into what is becoming, to which they themselves belong. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present inhabitable." Anything could happen, and whether we act or not has everything to do with it. Though there is no lottery ticket for the lazy and the detached, for the engaged, there is a tremendous gamble for the highest stakes right now. I say this to you not because I haven't noticed that this country has strayed close to destroying itself and everything it once stood for in pursuit of an empire in the world and the eradication of democracy at home, that our civilization is close to destroying the very nature on which we depend, the oceans, the atmosphere, the uncounted species of plant and insect and bird. I say it because I have noticed wars will break out, the planet will heat up, species will die out. But how many, how hot, and what survives depends upon whether we act. The future is dark. with a darkness as much of the womb as of the grave.